The only thing that's going to matter...
Look at what you're doing right now. The more we divide and silo ourselves, it's at our peril.
Did we miss something?
Hey friends, here at the Mission Forward podcast, we love sharing good finds with you, our listeners. And today I am super excited to bring you this bonus episode from our friends at the Chronicle of Philanthropy, who have just launched their own podcast called Nonprofits Now, Leading Today. We are super excited to give you a listen to their first episode, which features Tim Dixon, co-founder of More in Common, who joins our friend and Chronicle CEO Stacey Palmer to offer some really smart and research-based strategies that leaders like you can use to bridge divides in the workplace and in your community. So enjoy this special episode in which Stacey will ask Tim to walk listeners through his approach, and then meet us back here next week for an all-new episode of Mission Forward. Enjoy.
When there are these periods of social progress, social change, how does that take place? And I was really struck by the number of times where those stories were not the conventional story of one group in the community mobilized, demanded change and made it happen. That so much of when change takes place, it's when these much broader coalitions emerge.
Welcome to Nonprofits Now, Leading Today, a new podcast that gives nonprofit leaders a playbook to tackle today's most pressing leadership challenges. I am Stacey Palmer, CEO of the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and for our very first episode, I thought it was essential to focus on a topic that preoccupies many nonprofit leaders: navigating society's divides. Over and over again, whenever I'm talking to nonprofit and foundation leaders, especially in private conversations, what they share with me is the anxiety and difficulties they're facing as they try to deal with the many divides this nation faces. It's with their staffs, with their boards, and with their constituents. That's why I thought it was essential that we tackle this issue. We learned more about that in an exclusive Chronicle survey, where we found that 2/3 of nonprofit executives told us that the nation's fractures were making their jobs more difficult. It's a stunning statistic. The growing divides in the country, primarily related to politics and race, but also over issues like gender, urban-rural differences, and global events, affect the work of most organizations. To better understand how to handle these challenges, I went to Tim Dixon. He's co-founder of More in Common, an organization that helps leaders reach across differences and get things done. Over his career, Tim has worked on a slew of social change efforts, fighting economic inequality, modern-day slavery, and so much else. Tim focuses on research to help him understand how to heal divisions, knowledge that he puts to work coaching nonprofits around the world on how to make a difference in divided communities. He and I talked about how to deal with disconnects on our staffs and boards, why it's essential to forge unlikely partnerships to get things done, and why focusing on solutions, not just airing problems, is the key to success. And perhaps most important, Tim reminded me that even though it may seem risky to take on divisive issues, as nonprofit leaders, we must have the courage to stay true to our missions. After all, it's our leadership that makes the difference in these perilous times. Tim Dixon, thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited to talk to you today.
Thanks, Stacey. Great to join you.
I wonder if you can tell us about More in Common, the group that you founded. How did it come about? What made you decide to focus on this issue?
The most immediate thing, which was a very good friend of mine, Jo Cox, who was a member of parliament in the United Kingdom, she'd actually been quite a champion of different initiatives that I had started, and I'd got to know her quite well and her family. And she was attacked and brutally murdered, tragically, while she was just about to go into a local library and meet with voters in her district. And I was with her husband when that happened, and he got the call. But then I found myself in this very, very personal sense, in this tragedy and national tragedy that was just also like Britain is less accustomed to violence in public life the Gabby Giffords kind of attacks are more common in the US. So there was an extra shock value from that. And I really wanted, in Joe's honour, to do something that dealt with what felt like there's bigger forces at play now than just the normal politics, that the person who murdered her was somebody who'd been radicalised online, not involved in even any other groups. And I felt like I really wanted to get to the bottom of what is happening, what's changing in the dynamics of democratic societies. And that was the kind of a catalyst moment. And what we did with More in Common was, as four of us who initially started it, we were thinking we need to approach this not just in a single country context. So we started in the four big Western democracies of the US, UK, France and Germany. We now have Poland and Brazil as well. But we started by looking at what can we learn quickly about what's driving this? How can we do something that's very evidence-based, that really isn't just how we feel, but is well-grounded in behavioural science? And how can we be helpful in as large a scale as possible? And we felt we want to find solutions that have a good evidence base and then roll them out.
That's such important work, and it ties to something I want to ask you about because of research-based. We did a study at the Chronicle to ask nonprofit leaders how much the impact of all these divides in the United States were affecting them and their work and their ability to get things done. And 2/3 of them said that they were affected by this. I'm curious, what is it that you see? What are some of the challenges that nonprofit leaders are facing? Can you be specific about what they all are?
It's very difficult now to work on issues without in some way getting caught up in culture wars or some dimension of polarization. I mean, I remember I was in Ohio a little while ago now talking to a group of health commissioners, so people who work in public health, and they were saying how, they had seen their role in their community as being very apolitical and very far from the issues of division. And then COVID came along and they suddenly found themselves right in the center of that. Many of them felt very ill-equipped, unprepared for that moment. But suddenly the politics completely overtook that role of public health. And I think the same thing, you can think of areas like education, which can be quite non-political, and then suddenly an issue about what's the history curriculum, or masking in schools, even during the COVID period. Suddenly you get thrown into these moments of polarization. And I think that leaders across many different walks of life and in business as well have experienced that. As a leader, there is a set of skills where how you lead organizations well through periods of polarization. And I think it's really important for us to better understand those and to share the stories of where we're able to depolarize, or also, frankly, just make less mistakes, because sometimes organizations just walk into it quite unintentionally.
Tell me more about how people avoid the mistakes. What is your advice on doing that?
So let me give you a concrete example. We've done quite a lot of work on immigration, refugees. What we've found is that it's really important to sustain public confidence in immigration systems, in being a society particularly that is able to successfully integrate newcomers. Now, the way in which people with more progressive values communicate that is very much through the lens of compassion. Compassion as a value, this is all moral foundations work that we've integrated into a lot of our behavioural science work. Compassion is there for others, but there's many parts of the community where there are initial concerns, anxieties, apprehensions about newcomers that need to be addressed before, in a sense, the compassion is released. So to just communicate around immigration campaigns, for example, refugee campaigns, to just communicate on compassion when the concern is, hang on, is there a higher crime rate? Do these people respect our values? Are they going to get all sorts of benefits that nobody else gets? Addressing areas of concern is really important, because in a sense, people won't hear the compassion until some of those concerns are addressed. And what we've found with refugee sponsorship, which is a particular way of welcoming people that's very community driven, that's actually a very powerful way of addressing those concerns within a story that's very community centered. The impact in terms of shifting opposition among groups that are more concerned about immigration is really decisive. On many issues, people are not that fixed. In terms of their core values, they are pretty fixed. That's who they are. And we need to be communicating to the population in ways that respect people's values and don't just speak through the values that are prioritized by one group. And because a lot of the organizations in the nonprofit world are quite progressive, it might be their mission, it might be their board, but it's often the staff in particular, they can default into talking about an issue in a way that makes sense for a quarter of the population, but not for the other three quarters.
I'm curious from your conversations, what do you find are the things that help people get to some solutions in dealing with some of these issues? What are some of the first pieces of that you get them thinking about?
Yeah, for sure. Let me take some insights from work that we've just published on progressive activists, which is this group that, as I was mentioning, are typically about more than twice as likely to be found in a non-profit organisation than in other walks of life. Now, they're about 10% of the population, so they're not a huge proportion of the population, but they're really well represented in non-profit work and particularly in advocacy and policy and communications. And they bring lots of positive things to that, like a lot of conviction. They have a real commitment to working in purpose-oriented work. But one of the challenges with them is that they have an expectation of, a high level of participation in the decision-making within their organisation. They expect management to listen to them. And so understanding that expectation and being able to answer it becomes really important. And that's been an area where there's been real challenges in philanthropy and non-profits in the last few years. In terms of the solutions, we've just done a report in the United Kingdom. What we've found with that work is that there is a set of solutions that are quite practical that can help leaders to navigate their organizations through the dynamics of polarization. One of those is just thinking about how do you give people the sense of having a place within the organization where they can talk and they can contribute their ideas and question. And there's some level of accountability and just explaining the rationale for decisions. Interestingly, we've found the leaders who've had most success with that, they say that it's been in person rather than doing it remotely. Another dimension is the board. So making sure that your board understands your value set where you do and don't get involved in issues, because that's an area where sometimes decisions are made at the management level and then they get overridden by a board which has a different set of views. So it's important, that alignment. Recruitment and communicating expectations in the recruitment and onboarding process is important. Even actually asking people questions in the recruitment process to make sure that they understand that within an organization, you prioritize the organization's mission over your own personal political views. And that's important to communicate as how the organization operates. And I think another one is having policy on what issues you do and don't speak out on. So, for example, in this context, on Israel-Gaza, very contentious issue, we found that 55% of the progressive activists thought that their organization should be making a statement on that issue, even if they might be working on mental health or something quite unrelated, but they have that expectation to take a stand on every issue. And the general population's expectation, less than a third of people generally think that's appropriate for an organisation. And of course, it can become very divisive. So having clear lines, not lines that are developed in the middle of a debate internally, but having clear lines beforehand can really help communicate that clarity. And one thing we've heard about setting the forums for which the conversation with staff, doing smaller group forums is really helpful for the dynamic so that you don't get the person who's most confident and most strident dominating the conversation and creating a more adversarial environment. You get more people participating, and it's really important to have the voices of people who are maybe less extroverted and often actually more moderating voices for them to be able to take part. And they often feel intimidated if you just do large group formats where there's more conflict. If we apply those things, we can create an environment that's respectful, where people feel heard, where people with those strong views are honoured, but you don't allow the organisation's mission to be diverted. And, of course, don't play into what can become very time-consuming conflict.
So after you have some of these listening sessions and these small group conversations, what do you do next?
It then becomes a matter of focusing people's attention externally on your mission, your sort of place in the world. And one thing that we do with More in Commons work is we have, in each country we operate, a typology of the public, which tells a story of, what people's starting points essentially are in their orientation towards society. Only 1 in 3 people have a strong political identity in societies like the US and European societies. 2/3 are not. We talk about them as the exhausted majority in our work, that they get really fatigued with the level of conflict in politics. They have points of view, but the points of view they have, they don't have to override everything else, and they often can see that there's nuance, there's more than one argument. They don't hold those things as central to their identity. And understanding then the breakdown, and there's just different orientations where some people are more concerned about the protection of heritage and nostalgia. Other people are more, they think in terms of a very ordered society. They want the rules to be very clear, and they think fairness is about an equal application of rules. Other people who are really conscious of group identity, and they worry about threats from outside. And if you understand those as genuine motivations and orientations, then you can speak more effectively. And just to give you a very practical example, we've been working with a network of museums, which has a very large membership across the United Kingdom. And with them, they found that they were unintentionally, in their museum exhibits, the language that they were using to present all sorts of exhibits and to talk about the new programs they were doing was unnecessarily divisive, often using language really only communicated to a small proportion of the population. And then it was resulting in them being played into these sort of culture war conflicts. And they're able to say the things that they want to say without doing that. And some of this, it does come down to the communication function, becomes really important. And you need to do some decent research around the values. Even the fact that their membership, actually, the people coming in the door, was very diverse, representative of the whole of the community. But the way in which they were telling stories was really only going to communicate to 1 in 5. Having that starting point of a people-centered lens and less an issue-centered lens, you can avoid the trap of falling into these sort of cycles and spirals of polarization.
That's so important, especially what you said, that 2/3 of people are not thinking about these things when they wake up in the morning. And yet, because of the causes we're all working on, we are. And so we assume everybody else is. So trying to help your staff understand that feels absolutely critical. Are there any key sentences or words that you like to use that help people without dismissing the fact that people care deeply about these problems, but help them understand that most people aren't focused on them?
I think just looking at an issue and asking if there is this often false binary division, just asking yourself, what's the both and here? So, for example, we've done a lot of work on immigration, and the views on where American immigration policy go often become polarized between we should have more pathways for people to come into the country, or we should have stronger enforcement. And so we asked exactly that question in a huge post-election poll last year. And what we found was that even among Trump voters, only 30% said it's only about strong enforcement of our rules, of our laws. Half of them said, no, we should be doing both. Now, they're more concerned that the enforcement's not strong enough, so they'll emphasize enforcement. But they also say, no, we need new, legal pathways so people are coming in an orderly way into the country. And actually, among the Republican voters, there's more people who are in favor of immigration and those new pathways than against. I think that's a really good example to take. I know it's a very polarized issue, of course, and people have very strong views about, aspects of what the administration's doing. But it's just to say, actually among the people, there's more nuance than what you might imagine, and trying to get away from this idea that our world is described by two starkly opposed views. And I think the solutions are often about getting a bit granular, but doing it through the lens of people's values, because most people are actually flexible on issues but fixed on values. And people make the assumption that they're very fixed on issues. That's really only true for 1/3 of the population.
It's really important. I know one of the things as a successful effort is to get people to join what you might see as kind of unlikely coalitions. How do you do that? What do you mean by that? Tell me some examples about what that's all about.
Well, this is a historical reflection as much as anything else. When I was the Prime Minister's speechwriter in Australia, I had to do quite a lot of launching historical books and writing speeches for that. And so it made me think about and ask those questions of when there are these periods of social progress, social change, how does that take place? And I was really struck by the number of times where those stories were not the conventional story of one group in the community mobilized, demanded change and made it happen. That so much of when change takes place, it's when these much broader coalitions emerge. So, for example, I mentioned a moment ago refugee sponsorship. We've seen in the last decade this model see almost 1 million people come into countries and be welcomed through a sponsorship arrangement, which is like a family community welcoming people in. Now, the group that more often is responsible for actually welcoming is evangelical churches, many of which are very conservative evangelical churches. And they form a common cause with the people who are most pro-refugee in society now are typically quite strong, progressive activists. They have very different ways of viewing the world, yet they come together on that issue. And the community experience is really interesting. And often the thing that participants talk about is actually not the refugee family. It's the other people in the community they've met. And they say, like, I never thought we would have got on. And what I've realized is our community is much stronger than I thought, and that we can really do things together. And that's really important at a moment where we're experiencing such intense polarization, especially at a national level, when you've got those local experiences that are giving people confidence in each other.
Yeah, that's incredibly powerful. So if I wanted to get started, maybe I have an issue that I want to tackle and I want to think about who some of those unlikely players are and get them together. What would be some of my first steps?
On the more sort of local level, particularly, or a city level, it's often starting with people who already have some level of civic engagement. So they have stepped up to contribute. They have leadership. They have voice maybe within a community. So we did work recently. We just had a report that's come out called The Connection Opportunity. And we were looking at Pittsburgh, Houston, and Kansas City as 3 areas where there's practical things being done at the very localized level that are forming these sort of broader coalitions and are actually helping to depolarize, to build connection across difference. And what we found was it's not that there are communities within the country that are vastly different that aren't experiencing the forces of division. Everybody is, and we're in media environments where people get a lot of exposure to that. But there are solutions to that, and those solutions are often quite practical and local. So, for example, the Office of Neighborhood Services in Pittsburgh, they have meetings, they bring people together around basically problem solving at the neighborhood level. And they were finding that this polarization dynamics were coming through in very contentious adversarial meetings. And so a part of their change was to have more small group meetings, not having larger groups as much. And another one was actually physically changing the layout of the seating away from adversarial, you're literally facing the other side, towards doing the circular. So, some of those things are super practical. When in Kansas City, the Lycans Neighborhood Association, their practical thing has been rehabilitating damaged, disused, rundown housing. And they've been going for 6 or 7 years now. It's not a huge scale, but their whole thing is it's very intentionally bringing people from different parts of the community together. They've renovated 43 homes. People's sense of civic confidence that comes about from being involved in doing that kind of work is really powerful and contagious and brings other people in. And I think the key here is understanding that a lot of what's going to be most powerful is not to bring people into a town hall to say, let's talk about our differences and overcome them. It's actually much more, let's talk about how we can solve problems in our community. And when we have a focus that's outward or forward, then a lot of those sources of differences between us become at least less important, or they're things that we have to find our way through in order to get to the outcome that we all know that we want to achieve. At the local level, people's willingness to do that is stronger than what you'd imagine. The source of difference that they're most apprehensive about is political difference, much more comfortable with working across racial differences, across socioeconomic differences, across religious differences. The politics, because it's most associated with conflict, but people do see value in doing that. They say what they most lack is the opportunity to do that. It's not the willingness, it's the opportunity. So I think that's an insight as well, that you start where there is interest, but you also try to make it easy for people to step into maybe small levels of engagement and think of how you work them up the ladder of engagement as well.
And that's why it's so important for nonprofits to be the ones doing that, because they're trusted to take on those issues and tap into those solutions. I think that's wonderful advice. As we're talking, I love all the evidence that you have, and it's very compelling, but I also realize it takes a lot of courage to do some of the kinds of things you're talking about. And if you're counseling somebody about how to jump in, how to think about these things, how to mitigate risks, how do you get them to be revved up and ready to take all of this on?
Yeah, no, it's really true. And I think leadership is becoming more and more difficult, especially if you're in a role where you can be in the eye of the storm. I mean, I talk to elected officials and people's sense of fear in their roles now, and their fear of actually like their own side more than the other side very often. Peer relationships become really important, I think, because sometimes you can't talk publicly about some of the dilemmas that you're confronting, particularly if many of those are internal. Sometimes leadership in a time of polarization is more about standing up to more extreme voices within your own tribe, within your own community. And yet that leadership is so critical, because if you don't stand up to it, you can see that the division within society becomes more acute. And I think our MBA programs need to adjust to deal with some of the specifics of how you build border coalitions, understand the values of the communities that you're addressing, understand the way language is functioning differently in the environment we're in, understand that like we're in very distorted information environments where you can think like, oh, everybody's opposed to the position that we've taken. And it's like, no, it's a really small proportion. I had a friend who was a columnist in a magazine where they took a stance. They got a huge number of calls and people saying, I'm going to cancel my subscription. And he said at the end of that quarter, we had only lost 12 subscriptions. We would have got hundreds, if not thousands of calls about it. And we had our best fundraising quarter that we'd ever had. And yet they thought that their whole business model was collapsing in the middle of that moment. So that awareness that we're in this environment where there's a lot of distortion, and we need to have a sense of a ballast, a sense of a way to navigate through. And that's where our own personal resilience becomes really important as well, because you never know the moment when you're going to be suddenly cast into that world, and you need people that you can turn to for support and advice in those moments.
Absolutely critical. Offering that support is huge. I wonder, as you look at what's going on with all this misinformation, disinformation, crazy times that we're facing now, what do you think 5 to 10 years from now, where are we going to be? What do you think the odds are that we will have dealt with some of these problems? Will they get worse? Tell me your view of the future.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the dynamics that we're confronting are generational dynamics. They've been building for some time, and they're really locked in by our information environment. One thing that can help us to understand how it's possible to get through the moment that we're in right now is just to think about how polarization's been a reality in human societies, since the beginning of time. And there are many times where there's been profound divisions which now feel ridiculous, like that we can't even imagine why would those things have been so divisive. So if you think of the Protestant-Catholic split, I mean, in Europe, some hundreds of years ago, Catholics and Protestants were killing each other for many years through war. And in fact, if you think of Ireland, that's even in our own generation, that was happening. And yet if you talk to an 18-year-old today and you describe how Catholics and Protestants used to hate each other and used to be in conflict to the point of violence against each other, they'd kind of wouldn't understand why would that be, because they believe the same things and they look the same and they have the same kind of origins. And yet that was a reality, and it's only actually within our lifetimes that we've really seen that division substantially go away. I mean, people didn't think John F. Kennedy could be president in 1960 because he was Catholic, and that's in people's lifetimes. So the point is, there are these what feel like very entrenched divisions, but if we can find our way through, a generation from now, we might look back and think, what on earth were we going on about? We need to also understand that what we're dealing with isn't the first time that any human society has dealt with profound polarization. A society that seems to be riven by this profound polarization can get beyond that if there's leadership there, if there's imagination, and if that desire for peace can be harnessed and communities can come together. We can learn that, okay, we don't know when that's going to happen. We might be living with this for some period of time, but there is still an other side to get to. And if we can get to that without breakdown, without an explosion of violence, without a sort of systemic collapse, then that's success. The point is, like, there always is another day, and we're always building towards that better day. And if we do that, and if we keep people at the center of our approach, and we start with people and we finish with people, I think there's a way through.
This has been such a rich conversation with plenty of ideas to help me proceed and to help our listeners. So I appreciate it greatly. Given how challenging all of the things that you're dealing with are, I'm curious, how do you recharge? What allows you to keep doing this work?
Well, I think one thing, my role, because we're in 6 different countries, I do a lot of travel. And one of the wonderful things has been the opportunity to forge friendships with people from all sorts of backgrounds who are working towards similar ends. I meet just such great people. So that's a part of it. When I'm traveling different places, the other thing I love to just to see more the places that I'm in is I love to go for a 5, 6, 7 mile run. And that's just a way of, blowing the cobwebs out, but also seeing places and people. Yeah. And it's easy to be in a busy life. You can just be in and out of, meeting rooms, and it can be you're not really seeing the place that you're in. So that I find that really helpful.
Very, very good advice. Thank you for joining us today. This has been really an essential conversation for this moment and to help all of us go forward. I appreciate all the work that your organization does and everything that you've shared. Thank you so much.
It's been fantastic.
If you'd like more information about Tim Dixon and about the Chronicle's work on nonprofits and foundations bringing America together, you can find them in our show notes. Nonprofits Now, Leading Today is hosted by me, Stacey Palmer. It's produced by Emily Haynes at the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and from Reasonable Volume, Mary Dew is the producer. Mark Bush is our engineer, and Rachel Swaby and Elise Yu are executive producers. Additional support comes from Margie Fleming Glennon, Andrew Simon, Nick Adams, Krista Niles, Amaya Beltran, and Kyle Johnson. Join us on April 29th for episode 2. I'll talk to Kathleen St. Louis Caliento and Nick Grono about how nonprofit leaders can cultivate strong relationships with their boards. See you in 2 weeks.